morning. Today I'm speaking to Tony Dain. Very excited to be talking to Tony, who I met at the recent Brighton Chambers of Commerce Summit. In fact, I attended his workshop, so I know quite a bit about how he works, but looking forward to sharing that with listeners today. So Tony Dain from Future Vision Training, a performance coach and facilitator with 20 years experience working across business and in sport with footballers in particular. So I'm really fascinated to see where our conversation goes today. Tony, tell us what led you into a career in performance coaching and in particular helping individuals to look at and manage their emotions, which I know is a special area for you.
Oh, great question. And good morning, Annabel. And thank you so much for having me on your podcast. It was lovely to meet you at the Brighton Summit. So this is a real treat to hopefully have a really engaging conversation together. So how did I get into this world? So I guess, I've always been interested in sport. So from sort of 7 to 19, I played quite a high level of football, getting up to an academy standard, but then realising that just didn't kind of work for me. And for whatever reason, I wasn't kind of in that space. So I've always had this interest in sport. And then, of course, moving to London, going to university, I ended up working for a consultancy called Call Centre College that specialised in learning and development. So I was exposed there to the kind of the learning and development world and coaching. And that got very interesting and exciting because I think I'd always been interested, even when I was a kid, as to why some people could perform really well and consistently, and especially when things got difficult, and why other people couldn't. And I applied that to myself as well. So it was really interesting, kind of that. And then the emotions bit, I think, comes more from probably my own personal experience. So I lost my dad when I was 21. And up to that point, I'd probably had a really quite easy kind of life and not had to face too many difficult emotions. And then suddenly you're hit with like a raft of these feelings and emotions that you've probably felt in some way, but not really so consciously. And that was a real challenge. And I think I spent a lot of my time in those years after that, kind of ignoring that kind of space. My focus was elsewhere. I focused on making sure that my mum was okay, that work was okay, but not really was I okay. And probably after a couple of bouts of counselling and therapy, it was probably about 10 years later that I really recognised the stuckness that I had with a certain set of feelings and emotions, and that it wasn't really serving me, and it was limiting me in terms of both my work, my relationships, and probably my life that I was living. So I made a kind of conscious shift to think, okay, let me kind of dive into the emotions and get uncomfortable and see what kind of comes out. And hopefully on the other side of that, there'll be maybe a better place and a bit more of a balance and an understanding of myself. And that kind of then fed into Call Centre College and the work that we did, and this kind of passion I've had for what I call human skills. So, how we think, how we kind of self-manage those feelings, those thoughts and those emotions, how we interact with other people and ourselves, and then how we lead ourselves, and of course, how we lead other people. So that's kind of if that answers your question, that's a little bit of why I kind of got into this space and why it still kind of drives me now.
I really like that. Yeah, and thanks for being so candid about what led you into performance coaching. I like that phrase, conscious shift. And I think many of us perhaps have those moments, but then it's actually acting on it and maybe having that conscious realization and then taking action. So can you delve a bit more into describing your approach to helping footballers and teams build mental resilience? I mean, we've seen a lot with the Women's World Cup football recently, and they're following their fortunes or not. So how would you say you tailor your coaching techniques differently, perhaps for male and female footballers? I'm interested in that.
Oh, great question. Maybe we start there and we'll come back to the approach in a moment. So I'm fortunate. I work with both a men's football team and the women's football team, and have done for the women's team for the last couple of years to give me some experience in that space. And I think probably what I've noticed is an openness and an acknowledgement that what goes on up here has an impact of what goes on with your feet and your body. And that realization, I think, is much clearer when I work with the female footballers than it is with the male footballers. And I think what comes into that is fear. What I've tended to find, and we've got to be careful that we don't generalize, because there's always a lot of nuance in everything. But I think what I've tended to find is guys tend to be a little bit more guarded. They put this barrier up. We don't want to show any vulnerability. We've got to be strong. We don't want to be laughed at. We don't want to feel silly. Whereas a lot of my female players will kind of embrace that space first of all, and just be a little bit braver and more courageous in terms of going, well, yeah, I might feel a bit uncomfortable, but I'm going to go for it anyway. So that's, I think, one of the differences. And I think probably the biggest difference I've noticed with the men's and the women's teams is around when things get tough and when things get really difficult. And what I've noticed, and again, got to be really careful we don't generalize, but what I've noticed is that tends to bring my girls' team together, and they support one another even more, and really care and look out for each other. Whereas sometimes with the men's team, and it is changing, but sometimes with the men's team, it can be a little bit more like that. It can be a bit more heads rutting together. It can be a little bit more about kind of blame and frustration rather than pulling together, which I tend to see a little bit more with the women. But I think there are slight nuances. But fundamentally, my approach doesn't really change too much in terms of helping people think about developing what I call a framework for high performance. And that's a combination of some mindsets, some skill sets, and some tools and techniques that I think any of us can learn. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a neuroscientist. Yes, I've got qualifications in coaching and learning and things like that. But these are the sort of tools that I think any of us can learn and use. And they can be really beneficial, not just in terms of how we perform, but also our general well-being and the relationships we have with ourselves and other people. So I think there's a real importance in terms of just anybody that wants to kind of have a better life. It's worth having a look at what goes on up here and just checking your own thinking about how your emotional system works. You don't have to become a neuroscientist or a psychologist, but just a little bit of understanding, I think, can create one or two aha moments. Which is, as a facilitator and a developer of learning, that's of course what you're always looking for. You're looking for those aha moments when somebody's perhaps got a bit stuck, and then they see there's a different opportunity, or they've got more choices than they perhaps thought initially. And that's maybe part of what I see as part of my role as a coach, is more to help people see they've got different choices, and then they can make those decisions around the choices that they're going to take. Does that answer your question, Annabel?
Absolutely. No, fascinating. I love aha moments. I'm definitely going to refer to that in future. I think this male female divide thing, do you think it's a case of men perhaps accessing their more feminine side and women being able to access their more yang or male side, so that it's less gender based, it's more those qualities that we all probably have innately as humans?
Yeah, I think you could probably almost describe it in one word, and that I think it's probably empathy. I always use the term to empathize is to humanize. And I think sometimes, and again, we have to be careful, but sometimes females have more empathy and naturally a little bit more emotional intelligence. Not always, but sometimes. Whereas I think sometimes guys find that a little bit harder. They're quite, they can be quicker into judgment. Rather than being curious. And if we want to be empathic, one of the first things we have to do is to step out of judgment and be a little bit more curious about somebody else's world. So I think that plays a part in it, that kind of that empathy towards each other and that care, that genuine care that people have for one another. But I'm loath to kind of generalize too much, because it does vary individually. But there are some patterns. There are some things that you notice.
I don't want to open the floodgates of criticism, so I absolutely get it. It is very nuanced, and no, good to point that out. What about self-criticism and negative self-talk? If I could talk about myself just for a moment, I'm learning the saxophone, and I constantly have this voice that just says, Annabel, you want to play great jazz improvisation. When it comes to it, I harp a few tunes, squeak a few, and then sink into a ball in the corner. So what is it? How do you approach that with footballers and employees in the corporate setting? That self-criticism, negative talk. What strategies would you employ to help individuals overcome those patterns?
What a great question. And self-talk and the internal dialogue, I think, is this wondrous thing. This ability to reflect internally can be such a gift. But as you've highlighted, Annabel, it can also be an absolute curse. And, it can become our worst critic, as opposed to, if we can harness it in some way, it can be our own kind of super coach, our own little personal coach in our head. But like you say, that's not easy to do. And when we're caught in the moment, when we're in what I sometimes call this redhead state, where we go into that fight, flight, and freeze, which sets off these triggers and these thoughts, then that's where the challenge becomes. And I think, as you highlighted, you were in my session at the Brighton Chamber, and we talked about these things called ants. These automatic negative thoughts that just pop into our head, often triggered by a moment, an event, a person, a situation, or another thought, that can create a spiral. And so, we have to look at that. And I think what I tend to do is to start getting people to think about what's actually going on up there, and to begin to notice, are there any patterns to my thinking? Are there any little traps that I sometimes fall into that maybe don't serve me? And just, I describe it as kind of observational or noticing. And I think it's a really important quality for us that's very undeveloped as humans, that ability to notice how we're thinking, to notice how we're feeling, to the sensations in our body, etc., to notice the power of our internal dialogue. So I think the first step is to notice what's going on for you, and notice how you are when you're approaching a certain task, because how we approach a task has a really big impact on how we're going to deliver and whether we're going to be successful or not within that task. So if we go into a task and we see it as a challenge, then there's a good chance that we're not going to set off the alarm system, the fight, flight, freeze, and that we're going to have the confidence, the self-efficacy that we can succeed, even if it gets difficult. And this ties into things like growth mindset and having a challenge mindset. So being able to take on difficult tasks, but have the confidence and the self-belief that I've got the tools and the resources within me to cope, even if at first it might be a struggle, and that's okay. So I think that's a really key part initially, to kind of work on that piece. And then you can begin to unpick some of that, and you can begin to reframe some of it. So you can begin to think about, what are facts and stories here with what's going on in my internal dialogue? And can I learn to just acknowledge that, thoughts are just clouds in the sky. They just float by. They don't define us. They're not who we are. So can I begin to smile at them and just notice them? And, if it's a particularly negative thought, like, perhaps something around the saxophone, like, I'm never going to be able to learn this piece. You can recognize that for what it is. It's just the little voice going, yeah, we're just having a little chat in the background there, but actually we don't have to pay attention to it. We can quieten it down a little bit, and then we can apply some techniques and tools as well in the moment. So, one of my favorite tools to settle the internal dialogue is a little technique called distancing. Which works on a very simple principle. We're all better off giving advice to other people than we are taking our own. And so this distancing technique creates a little bit of space between you and yourself. So what you tend to do is you talk to yourself in the second or third person. So as an example, I've never done a podcast before, so I was a little bit nervous this morning. So I did a little bit of breathing, and then I just said to myself, Tony, you know what you're doing, you've got this. I don't normally walk around talking to myself by calling myself Tony, but it's a clever little technique that, some people call these things, I guess, brain hacks or stuff like that. But it's just a clever little technique that allows a little bit of space. So I think you can learn to harness your self-talk for better performance. You can allow it, not just turn it positive, because we can create this thing called false positivity. But I think what we can do is we can reframe it, and we can look at it in a slightly different way. And if we've got time, you can do some different exercises that you can really explore your thoughts and really do a little bit of work around that. But sometimes when we're in the moment, i.e. we've got an important game, we're about to take a penalty, or we've got a really important meeting at work, or a really difficult conversation, we haven't necessarily got time to sit down and work through an exercise. So we need to have one or two what I call in the moment tools or techniques that we can use to immediately just bring ourselves back into the present. Because that's really the challenge. When the internal dialogue goes off, it's typically going off about the past, or it's going on off about the future. It's not thinking about what's going on now. And if we're going to perform at our best, we want to be in that moment right now, right there, thinking about what we're going to do next. What's that next action I'm going to take? What's the next conversation I'm going to have? Whatever it might be, work or business. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's really clear, and there's some really lovely steps that I hope listeners will be able to take away. That the idea that you can reduce the power of those ants, those automatic negative thoughts, by acknowledging they're there, not creating a false positivity that I'm suddenly Superwoman, breathing techniques, putting it in the second person, distancing. And I think there was one extra thing we did do at the summit actually, which was the Superwoman pose or the Superman pose, to actually use your physical presence to expand and feel that confidence. So all great tips. That's fantastic to hear it all in one conversation.
We're talking of that, Annabel. There's a physical presence. Just to finish off on that bit, there's a little piece where, if you watch a video online, I think it's one of the ex-All Black captains, and he talks about, he does the breathing, he does the self-talk, and then he does a physical thing to bring himself back in the moment, where he slaps his leg. And it literally shocks him back into, right, I'm back in the present moment. So what we tried was a slightly different version of that, but you're shaking yourself into a different state, bringing yourself back into the moment. So I'm sorry.
That's right. Yes, I remember it was like the dog getting out of the basket. They shake themselves, and you're suddenly in the zone and in the new moment. Yeah, I love that. Tell me a bit more about. You mentioned taking penalties, about intense pressure and high stakes situations, either in business or on the football pitch. Can you share some examples of how you've perhaps helped somebody or some teams, a team, on how they manage that performance anxiety? Anything beyond that we've already covered? Focusing on
I mean, performance anxiety is really interesting, isn't it? Because it can affect us in a number of different ways. You know, it can affect us physically in terms of things like we tighten up, we get an increased heart rate, our blood pressure goes up, you know, blood flow reduced, etc. Things like that. So it can have a physical impact. It can have a cognitive impact, i.e. the ants, the thoughts going off. It can have a what I call an emotional impact. So, you know, that overwhelming feelings and emotions in the body, the sensations that we feel, the nerves, the excitement, the worries, etc. So, you know, performance anxiety is interesting in itself, and I think a key part of it is how we perceive it and how we perceive pressure. You know, that has a really big link to whether we're going to be anxious or not, and it ties back in a little bit to what I sort of talked about previously, which is that challenge mindset. Because performance anxiety comes out of that threat state. So, you know, when we're not in a good way, when we're not feeling comfortable, we're not safe and secure, we begin to have these doubts about ourselves. So for me, there's two things really. One is our preparation. So who's preparing for a key performance moment. So, you know, Ronaldo is a great example, and he used to take a penalty. If you watched him, you would see him literally disconnect from the environment around him. He would go into himself. Now, I don't know what he was doing, but I imagine there was some degree of self-talk, visualization happening in there of him talking to himself, visualizing him taking that penalty, and literally just locking himself into that present moment, visualizing himself doing it, and boom. That, of course, takes practice. And that's the other key thing here. Most of these techniques and tools aren't particularly difficult to learn. What's really difficult is turning them into habits. You know, there's a big difference between knowing and doing. And that's the really key bit here. So it's about building up those habits. So preparation in this instance is key. So preparing to perform as well as in the moment. So the preparation piece will be some work with the athlete or the performer in the weeks, months leading up to those moments. So when they get to a pressurized situation, they've already had the tools and the techniques and the practices, and that's a key word. They'll have been practicing them in less high tense environments, so that then when you are in a real pressure environment, it's easier to lean back into that tool because you've used it before, you're more comfortable with it. So lots and lots of practice in that sense. And then it really comes back to some of the things that we've just touched on. So in the moment, the breathing, the self-talk, so that ability to control our thoughts, you know, so that we are present. So again, it's not, some of this isn't rocket science. It's about, you know, having the, what's the word? Having the commitment, I think, having the commitment to practice, even if at first it doesn't feel like it's making too much difference. And breathing's a great example of that. When you do a little bit of breath work, you do it to start with, and it feels quite good, but you don't necessarily notice those shifts. But when you begin to do it on a regular basis, you really begin to see the benefit. And I think that's the thing. We have to kind of try and see a bit of a benefit, and then we lean into it a little bit more. It's kind of human nature, isn't it? What's in it for me? Kind of show me I'm going to get some benefit, and maybe I'll do a little bit more of it. So I think it's a combination of preparation, getting that right, getting the practice right, having some tools in the moment that you can use. And really that's probably about it. I mean, there's some depth underneath that you could go into, but in terms of a general approach, in terms of managing pressure and those high performance moments, that would be my approach, and very similar for business as well. Because of course, in business, we're not going out and playing a game of business, but we do have what I call thousands of important performance moments and conversations every single year. And as leaders, the power of those conversations is incredible. So if we're having that many every year, isn't it important that they're good? Isn't it important that we go into those conversations feeling prepared, being present, feeling good about ourselves, and ready to perform at our best, even if it's difficult? So we've all had those, those difficult conversations at work, that really tricky one-to-one that maybe we didn't want to have, that awkward client call that maybe sets off some of those thoughts in our head. But wouldn't it be great if we've got a set of tools and a little framework that we can kind of lean back into in those moments, so that those moments gradually become less pressurized and just become almost like the new normal, because we've kind of adapted and flexed ourselves. So we're in a space where we can cope with that variation, cope with those different levels of intensity at times. And I think that's a key bit. It's just having that range. I think that's a key word for me, having range.
Excellent. Gosh, I've got loads of scenarios running through my mind of different business situations I've faced over decades. So yeah, no, I really resonate with what you're saying, and that preparation is key. But then having that absolute mindfulness moment where you're about to face that pressure, or you're under that pressure, and how you then deploy those tools. It's really fascinating. You mentioned leadership there, and of course, with the news agenda as it is, and shifting cabinet shuffles this week.
Mm.
The terrible situation in Gaza and Israel, and leadership very much in the forefront of the news agenda. How do you help your clients and footballers to develop their effective communication and leadership skills? And how do you feel those skills then contribute to the team's success? What's your
Oh, great question. Let me unpack that a little bit. So I mean, I think communication is a fundamental leadership skill in any high performing team, business, operation. Communication generally is really, really good, because it's the glue that binds us all together. As a leader, it's how we inspire, how we engage, how we motivate, how we give feedback, how we coach, how we have all of those different types of performance conversations. So the communication is really, really key. Our communication can demonstrate how much we care for somebody. So empathy. So all of that, I think, is really critical. So what am I saying here? Great communication is essential to a great leader. What do I think great leadership, and what do I try to cultivate there as leaders? I think for me, there's two things that I think if you can get really good at as a leader, then you're in a good place. And number one, I think you have to fundamentally care. And what I mean by that is you have to care about the person above the performer or the player, because they're a person first of all. Yes, they're a performer. Yes, they're a salesperson, or they're a leader, or they're a manager, or they're a coach. But first of all, they're a person. So you have to demonstrate that genuine care about that person. And that comes through taking an interest in that person. What are their experiences? What are their values? What are their drivers? What are their motivations? What are their goals? And really taking a little bit of time to understand that. So, for me, it links into empathy here, having an empathy for other people and the people around you, and being genuinely interested in them. So I think if you have that as a foundation as a leader, that, I genuinely care about the people that I am responsible for, because as a leader, you're a custodian of people. You're a custodian of people, and those people don't have to follow you. So really for me, it's how do we create a culture and a climate where people want to follow and want to work with you and to achieve these notions of shared goals, etc. So I think that's really key, that care. And then the second thing I think as a leader is you have to be able to show people how they can get better and how they can learn and how they can grow. And if you're able to help people grow and develop and at the same time care for them, I think you're in a really good place as a leader. And of course, there's a whole raft of leadership skills. And I talk about my focus is on what I call human skills for high performance in leadership. So I don't tend to get into the weeds of, strategy and tactics and the sort of the technical side of leadership. I'm really interested in the human side of it. How do we inspire and engage? How do we create climates and cultures where people feel themselves, feel they can learn and make mistakes, feel they can contribute, feel that their voice is heard and they can challenge where it's possible. I like to describe it, and I picked a little bit of this from one of the guys up at the Brighton conference who used the phrase, I like high challenge, low threat. And I thought it was a lovely phraseology. And I was talking about this to my team last night at football because we're actually playing Brighton tonight. So we've got a high pressure game. It's a bit of a free hit because we're not expected to win, but there's going to be a level of pressure because there'll be a larger crowd and you're playing Brighton. So we did a little bit of work on this last night and that was quite interesting. But hey, I digress. Those two things, key with leadership. And of course, if we get all of that right, then we get, great collaboration, great relationships, great performance, people knowing their roles and their responsibilities, and I think for me, having a set of what I call shared, I kind of call it purpose, values and goals. If you've got a shared purpose, you've got some common values and you're aligned towards a set of goals, then generally you're in a good place and you're working together as a team. And I think as a leader, it's your role to help shape and create that with your team and then really role model that. And I think that's a key thing for leaders is that ability to role model, to walk the walk. And what I don't mean is to pretend. And I don't mean you have to pretend to know everything, because I think the best leaders that I've met are the leaders that are quite happy to turn around and say, I don't know. I don't have the answer at this stage, but I'm confident between us as a group, we can find that answer. That little bit of humility and that little bit of vulnerability can go a long, long way. So does that answer the question?
Yeah, I'm just reveling in your words. I mean, I wish I had you as my performance coach and football coach and everything coach. You have a very calm and clear way of expressing what the challenge is and then how you'd approach it. I like your style, Tony. That's what I'm trying to say.
Oh, thank you, Annabel.
I'm going to close with one final question because you do span this very interesting world of sports and business, and of course, and I keep coming back to politics just because there's so much change going on in the world at the moment. But you've got this really fine balance between perhaps healthy competition and teamwork. You want people to be strong leaders and go get and bring people with them, but also you want that cohesive, collaborative team effort going on. So what are your views? How do you foster that competitive spirit whilst ensuring it doesn't hinder that team cohesion? And I'm not in the cabinet today, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, what a great question to end on. I think this is a little bit of a climate question, and begins to tap into some of the things we started talking about yesterday earlier. So for me, you have to create a shared vision. So having a shared purpose and a set of shared principles, we might want to call them values, and some goals, so that this is about teamship. It's about together it's about the team rather than the individual. So I think that's a key starting point for me, that you focus on creating this shared vision that everybody connects into and recognizes their role within that. And I think the competition piece for me is a competition with themselves. And I encourage them to compete more with themselves than rather with each other. And to compete, and what I mean by that is compete heavily with yourself to get better. Challenge yourself to be the best that you can be. And then, of course, what we can do is everybody's in that kind of space. We can begin to challenge each other to get better. We can stretch one another. But at the same time as we do that, we're really, really strong on support as well. We'll push and we'll stretch and we'll challenge, but we'll give lots of care and support and all of that at the same time, so people feel safe to really go for it and to experiment and take some risks. So I think that's really, really important. So I think for me, it's a combination of, on a kind of a team level, having those shared goals and expectations and ways of working. And then on an individual level, it's much more about you challenging yourself rather than competing against each other. I'm a firm believer that collaboration trumps competition every time. I'm not 100% convinced, and I don't know, but I'm not 100% convinced that this desire to always create competition between people is necessarily a driver of some of the best outputs. It does work for some people, but that competition approach doesn't work for a lot of other people. So I think that we can be a little bit more nuanced in our approaches there sometimes in terms of how we perceive competition. And don't get me wrong, that's not about making everything non-competitive. It's not, but sometimes competition can go too far and drive the wrong behaviors. So I think we have to think about that a little bit. And again, ties into sometimes a little bit of old school thinking, those people are highly competitive, they're bound to be the winners and the best people. And, we've learned that sometimes things are a bit more nuanced than that. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely, and a great way to end. Thank you so much for taking us through so many interesting things. We've got aha moments, we've got ants, we've got mindfulness, the qualities of leadership, the fact that you need to care for people as people above everything else, and to help people to learn and grow are the two key factors: care and learning, helping people to learn and grow. So I've absorbed so much in just 25 short minutes. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time today, Tony, and look forward to meeting you in person again soon.
Oh, it's a pleasure, and thank you for asking such great questions, because that's what ultimately makes the conversation, isn't it? The quality of the questions that are asked.